Christopher Borick, political science professor at Muhlenberg College, we're all watching the race for president in the November 5th election, but tell us why the races for Congress are important as well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Larry. The world is looking at Pennsylvania right now because of our importance in the electoral college scene with our 19 electoral votes. But just as we'll have an enormous impact as a Commonwealth in deciding the next president, we'll also have an outsized impact on which party will control the House of Representatives in the next Congress. Pennsylvania has a handful of competitive seats. As viewers may know, Congress is thinly divided, with Republicans having a slight majority in seats right now in Washington in the House of Representatives. And therefore, because we have a number of competitive seats, we can go a long way to determining which party might actually control the House come 2025.
So considering that, Chris, what effect does having president on the ballot have for these down ballot congressional races? More interest, right?
Yeah, it is more interest. We'll have bigger turnout comparatively to a year like 2022, which was pretty high for a midterm election. But we'll have many more Pennsylvanians go to the ballot this fall. And a lot of those individuals are coming in for the presidential race. So historically, we've looked at the relationship between a presidential campaign and the House races. And it's not clear. When you have a landslide election, for example, you will have some coattails and people will get carried in with you. Those are less common in contemporary American politics. And they're certainly less common in a state like Pennsylvania, where you have very tight races in the last few presidential cycles, where candidates win by half a point or a point. There's not long coattails to hang on to when those types of margins that we're looking at. And so in this year, I imagine it's a similar situation, but it's not to say that the presidential races themselves will not have an effect because of who they draw in to the races, rather than the dominance of one candidate or the other.
And before we get to that handful of competitive congressional races here in Pennsylvania, let's consider turnout. So what kind of a turnout are we anticipating now? It's only the election's right around the corner.
Yeah, this is the question that I think is captivating everybody. Larry, it really could go a long way to determining who wins the presidential race, a number of these congressional races. Just how high it will be. It will be a high turnout election. Early are what we're seeing in terms of mail ballots, what we're seeing in terms of polling, trying to gauge excitement and interest in the race, paints a picture that Pennsylvanians are going to turn out. And they have lots of reasons to turn out, right? You have a presidential race, premier race, you have a competitive U.S. Senate race, you have competitive House races that we're talking about today, and you have control of the state legislature in the balance, where Democrats barely hold the House, the Republicans have a narrow lead in the Senate. There's never been, I think, in contemporary Pennsylvania politics, more reason to go vote. We have incredible choice as voters in the state, and I think that will have an impact on voter turnout. Just how high is the question? You know, when we get up around the between 60 and 65% turnout levels, people might say, well, that doesn't sound over the top. Historically, that's really high in a race, and so we're going to see numbers, I think, in that ballpark. But just how high we'll get, I think, is going to be really crucial. And who's in that mix at the end of the day? Who's coming in? We often talk about irregular voters that don't often vote in midterm elections or off-year elections, but may vote in presidential elections. Just what group within that irregular voting cohort that I'll describe will show up is a big question.
Chris, let's get down to business and talk about these congressional races that are especially competitive here in Pennsylvania. We're going to do them in numerical order. So we're going to start with District 1, and that is a race involving Brian Fitzpatrick and Ashley Ehasz. Now, let's consider the incumbent here, Brian Fitzpatrick. What has his agenda accomplished so far?
Yeah, when you look at Representative Fitzpatrick, you see one of the most moderate Republican members of Congress. He comes from that first congressional district. Folks that know the Pennsylvania map will locate it largely in Bucks County in the southeastern part of the state, running along the Delaware, that classic, bucolic landscape that people associate with Bucks County. It's a suburban, rural, some small pockets of urban in the district. But Fitzpatrick comes from a family that has represented his brother, Mike, represented the district before him. They've become kind of an institution, if you will, within Bucks County politics. And he's had success in this district that if you looked by demographics and where it is, you would say is a place that Democrats should do well. But because of his moderate politics, he's been able to win in competitive cycles moving back over 2022, 2018 in this area and win fairly comfortably in those races, despite the demographics that might point to opportunities for Democrats. And he's been able, for example, in 2020, while Joe Biden won his district fairly handily, he won by double digits at the same time. So that gives you a sense of his strength as a candidate. And candidates do still matter in these localized congressional district races.
What have Brian Fitzpatrick's general priorities been so far in Congress?
Yeah, he's looked, like I said, his record is fairly moderate in terms of his votes, seen as more.
What are the issues he's interested in, Chris? Let's put it that way.
Oh, okay. He's worked a lot on, for example, you would not think a Republican would lead on environmental issues and conservation issues. That's been one of the areas that he's taken a very active role, stressing his actions on a number of environmentally related matters. He's also been interested, you look in issues like healthcare, where he's played a significant role, an issue that we associate with both parties, but might give you a sense of the priorities that he would have as a member of Congress.
Chris, you've heard about the general topics that are circulating about this race, and certainly abortion and immigration are among them. And if we apply those two topics to either of these candidates, what are they saying that could influence voters?
Yeah, sure. Those are two key issues. Polls show it over and over again, Larry, that those are on voters' minds. They're top tier issues. We usually, when we poll, we'll see after the economy, immigration, and abortion, reproductive rights at the very next level. And in the first congressional district, I think they're once again important. This is an issue that Democrats, reproductive rights is an issue Democrats think they have an advantage on. If you look at the polling, and you could see it in their ads, in a district like the first that is fairly moderate, the Democratic candidate, in this case, has been using that as a core in her messaging to try and make, I think, headway among an audience in the first that probably aligns pretty well with her positions. What Fitzpatrick has done, when you look at his positioning, I think is and this is positive for him as a more centrist candidate. He's able to say, look, here's my positions on this are moderate. My positions on reproductive rights have always tended towards the center. And he could use that to in some ways, offset the potency of an issue like this, where Democrats generally have some success.
Before we go any farther, Chris, let's consider the challenger in this race, and that is Ashley Ehas. Who is she? Where'd she come from?
She is, and this is interesting. We've got a couple candidates this time, Larry, that have military experience. She is a West Point grad. I think she studied at Oxford. So a resume. I love looking at resumes of candidates. Very impressive resume and very impressive background. She's done some work in the policy fields, but hasn't held elected office before, as at least from what I've seen. So she's a relative newcomer. She's fairly young in terms of candidate ages, and again, challenging an incumbent is never easy, especially a well entrenched incumbent in a district like the first.
So, Chris, you've been keeping track of these congressional races for at least a couple of years. So let's just consider what we've learned in general about the value of emphasizing a military service record.
Yeah, it's time honored, Larry. In America right now, a lot of institutions are under stress. There's doubt and distrust of many things. We still, as a country, place a priority on military service. We honor it. We value it. And therefore, for candidates, having that as part of their background is, I think, essential. And you see it in Pennsylvania. We'll talk about other congressional races this time. You see it, Dave McCormick, who's running for U.S. Senate, is a West Point grad. It's also something that is relatively rare right now. While many Americans serve, a fairly small percentage do. If you look at the overall adult population, and therefore having that does in some ways signify a special relationship. You're trying to serve during an elected office, running for office. Serving your country always aligns nicely with that. So I think it remains a big asset for candidates.
Chris, something happened during this congressional District 1 campaign that I find unusual anyway. And I understand that Fitzpatrick declined to debate Ehas on the grounds of hate speech. She had insulted him with a profanity, which doesn't interest me, but the fact that he called that hate speech, he said, I'm not going to engage with her.
Yeah, it was an interesting incident, Larry, in the sense that, how we define hate speech, as you can say, I think is contested. Some people might talk about the things that she said and say, well, I don't know if that necessarily qualifies as what most people would say is hate speech. There's also a strategic element. Again, we'll take anybody on their word. But incumbents generally, if they don't have to, don't want to give challengers opportunities to land punches. And so more often than not, if you're ahead in the polls, and I haven't seen a lot of polling there, but given his track record, probably is at an advantage. Why give opportunity? So I don't know his motives. We take it on what he says. But strategically, there's also reasons not to debate when you are a front runner.
So let's move on to District 7, Chris, and that would be Susan Wild. She's the Democrat. She's the incumbent versus Ryan McKenzie. And Susan Wild, let's consider her history holding this seat in Congress.
Yeah, Representative Wild, Congresswoman Wild, is running for a fourth term. She first was elected in 2018. This is the 7th congressional district, largely the Lehigh Valley. Important to note, Larry, after redistricting after the 2020, the district became moderately more conservative. It's Lehigh and Northampton counties, which are the heart of the Lehigh Valley, but they moved a section of the old 7th district over in Monroe County up to the 8th and added in Carbon County. Carbon County, for folks that don't know, is northwest of the Lehigh Valley, rural nature, very conservative in its politics. And that made the district a bit harder. And the first time she was tested in that district, her new district lines, was 2022. And she won a very tight race, winning by a couple of points over Lisa Scheller, who she ran again against both in 2022 and 2020. So it's a consummately middle of the road district. Most of the national ratings that rate districts place this as very much a toss-up type of district.
And before we get into the issues in that district, Chris, let's consider Ryan McKenzie. And he has a history in the state house, doesn't he? And how might that carry over to whatever he could accomplish in Congress?
Yeah, Representative McKenzie is a pretty known political figure in the Lehigh Valley, specifically Lehigh County, which he has served in the state legislature for a number of terms. He comes from western Lehigh County, kind of more the suburban, rural areas within the county, west of Allentown. He is someone that has been involved in local GOP politics for a long time. He's not known, and this is the challenge often, while Congresswoman Wild has won in her district now a number of times, including the new district, he's served a portion of the district in the state legislature. That's, over in Lehigh County, but the area encompasses Northampton County, Carbon County. And so one of the challenges, I think, for him and anybody that's not an incumbent is getting your name out there. And as you probably know, right now in Pennsylvania, with so many competitions going on electorally, getting the attention of voters is really, really hard. And so we've done some polling on this district. It's a very competitive race. But notably, earlier this month when we polled the race, about a fifth of individuals didn't know much about him at all, which poses opportunities, but also challenges for him.
So let's try to relate this race to the economy, which, as you pointed out, is certainly the top issue, and people are always concerned about that anyway. And consider Susan Wild, her being a Democrat, it's not surprising that she should tout the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. She says that reduced the cost of insulin and prescription drugs. I wonder if voters are listening carefully to that message.
Yeah, she's tried to get out in front of that issue. This is a challenge for Democrats in this cycle. Most polls show Republicans have an advantage when it comes to inflation and economic issues. So she, like other Democrats, especially incumbents, have tried to say, here's where her record, here's where her votes, here's where her leadership is addressing that. And as she said, healthcare has always been a particular interest of Congresswoman Wild. She stressed her efforts in areas like mental health, price issues, like you said, with insulin. You'll see that highlighted in a lot of her ads. And indirectly, reproductive rights often associated with health in Democratic messaging. She's very much profiled that issue. She's over the last two cycles, probably more than any other issues. She's put in her ads. It's dealt with reproductive rights, often kind of interspersed with broader health messages.
Now, it's worth noting that opponent McKenzie in this race has voted in favor of an abortion ban at 20 weeks. Now, that was a while ago, and that was vetoed by Governor Wolf. Anyway, it gives insight into his politics, obviously.
Yeah, and it's something that he's, like a lot of Republicans, has had to manage in terms of the campaigns. It's shown up in a lot of her ads. There's been an effort, I think, to paint Representative McKenzie and other Republicans as extreme on that issue, citing past records. And this was always the interesting thing. Republicans in a lot of places, including Pennsylvania, voted regularly on reproductive rights before the Roe decision. And largely, given the Roe decision that was in place and precedent in the United States, meant that those votes were fairly inconsequential. They just wouldn't have impact because of the nature of the federal laws and the federal court decisions. Those cases are being brought back, or those previous votes brought back into this election cycle to paint candidates as more extreme.
And often when we talk about abortion rights, we talk about women's reproductive rights as well. And I understand Susan Wild wants to protect access to in vitro fertilization. We've been hearing a lot about that in recent months, Chris.
Yeah, IVF emerged last year as a major part of the reproductive rights debate, and also, therefore, the broader political debates right now. And individuals like Congresswoman Wild have highlighted that issue, painting some statements by Republicans, including former President Trump, painting votes in other states on IVF and restrictions on IVF as a matter that gives Democrats a clear advantage because IVF and policies are generally viewed very favorably by the public.
One more question about this campaign. Media reports are saying that McKenzie has embraced America First policies of Donald Trump. And I haven't heard about that very much during the campaign. Give me an example or two.
Well, like many Republicans right now, you're navigating GOP politics. I've always seen, following and looking at Representative McKenzie, I think he emerged from a traditional Republican background, maybe your classic Pennsylvania Republican. People in the Lehigh Valley might remember Charlie Dent, congressman here, who's in the middle of the road. This is the Republicans you might associate with. Like many other Republicans, he's had to navigate the party's change with the ascension of a more populist party with the leadership of former President Trump. And so he's had to navigate, including winning a primary in a GOP primary, the alignment with what might be called an American First agenda. And that comes with some positives. It's attractive to a group of voters and a base, but also in a more centrist district could be a bit challenging to navigate.
Let's move on to District 8, and that would be Matt Cartwright. He is the incumbent and the Democrat in Robert Bresnahan. Now, Cartwright has held this office since 2013. How about a short bio and what kind of mark he's made during his tenure?
Yeah. Representative Cartwright, as you said, has been now in office for quite a bit of time. Represents the 8th Congressional District, which is largely the heart of the Wyoming Valley, Scranton, parts of Luzerne County towards Wilkes-Barre, and then up to the northeast corner of the state. So it's got an urban core, but very rural for much of the district as you get up into Pike, Wayne counties, northern Monroe County. It has that element to it, and it's a district, by the way, that is leans more Republican than Democrat, especially in recent years, as Republicans have made gains in northeastern Pennsylvania. He is like Congresswoman Wild, and to a degree on the Republican side, Representative Fitzpatrick, more center-leaning within the ranks of House members. All three of the individuals in those eastern Pennsylvania districts, the 1st, the 7th, and the 8th, I think fit that bill. Certainly, they have to move with their party left and right. But largely, he's tended to be more centrist in his politics for a district like the 8th. He stresses, if you followed him, lots of economic development. That's always been key in northeastern Pennsylvania, post-industrial, an area that struggled, right? The Scranton region. So business development, economic development, transportation have been areas that he's been particularly invested in. Because those things are often pretty popular for a region that looks for that kind of economic stimulus.
Now, Cartwright's opponent in this race in District 8 is Robert Bresnahan. Chris, what does his resume look like?
He's a younger candidate. We've talked about that with a few of the people we've talked about as challengers this time. I think that's a theme that you might see in a number of these competitive districts. He's from Luzerne County. He's a business person, I think in construction areas that he looked at. So he's new, again, fairly new to politics. I think this is his first run. Again, he might have had some other things that I'm not aware of, but at least on a congressional level, he is someone that Republicans are excited about. It's the type of candidate they're hoping to make the face of their party: young, business-oriented, capable of making a kind of a broader pitch than sometimes the party has been seen as being able to do, and he's raised optimism in a district like the 8th that it could be flipped. And again, because it is the type of district, if you look, Larry, where Republicans perform pretty well, but have been unable to unseat Cartwright. And I think again, at least from Republican circles, Bresnahan's the type of candidate that they're excited to have the potential to do that.
Let's move on to District 10, and that would be Scott Perry. He's the Republican. He's the incumbent in that race versus Janelle Stelson. She's the Democrat. And give us a brief background on Perry and maybe some events in recent years that have brought him into a bold relief for voters in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Representative Perry, of course, has taken on a national profile in his seat. And you look at the district, we could talk like we did with the 7th district, some changes there that have made it a little more challenging for him, like the 7th is for Susan Wild. But of course, member of Congress, came to national profile, I would argue, of course, in 2020, during the post-election issues that led up to January 6th. A lot of attention on his relationship with former President Trump and the efforts in Pennsylvania regarding the election and the election results. Certainly, that put him on the national map. He's a member of the Freedom Caucus, has been involved with the Freedom Caucus, which is a more conservative, sometimes seen as controversial caucus within the Republican ranks in the House of Representatives. And he's become a bit of a lightning rod politically. Because of his engagement there. And when you're a lightning rod getting a lot of attention, it usually draws the opposition party to try and target you. And I think that's exactly what's happened this year in the 10th congressional race.
And speaking of being a lightning rod, Perry had the story was that Perry had his cell phone taken away by the FBI. What happened there anyway?
It was part of the investigation that went on about post-election attempts to undo the Pennsylvania results or circumvent the Pennsylvania results, part of the broader investigations that had gone on by the Justice Department and the special prosecutors, and he was a target of that. He was part of the investigation, and his records were through his phone. I guess confiscated. I don't know what the best word to do it to use as evidence in the trial.
So let's consider. Let's keep going, Chris. Our time is limited. I want to cover all these races if we can. Let's consider his opponent here, Janelle Stelson. She's a Democrat. She does not have a national profile like he does, but she does have some experience in the mid-state, and a lot of people have seen her on TV.
Yeah, and that's important, Larry. She is, as we've talked about now, pretty new to politics and elected office or running for elected office, but no stranger to many people in the district. She is a former anchor woman with a regional media outlet in South Central Pennsylvania. That puts you in a lot of people's living rooms for a long period of time, and that familiarity is I don't know if it's priceless. Probably has a price in politics that you could put on, but very valuable for candidates, because often we talk about incumbent advantage. Incumbents have name recognition. They've passed the test already by being elected. Challengers often are, and we could talk about this time around, under-resourced, don't have as much money or name recognition, and those things go hand in hand. She has both. She has name recognition, and she has some resources that I think partly because she has name recognition. And she's running a really challenging Congressman Perry in the hardest of ways. This district is moved a little bit more Democratic after the redistricting. It's becoming more suburban as we see growth in areas like Dauphin County, which is at the heart of this district. It's harder terrain for Republicans to protect. And this is a challenging race, and the Democrats' best bet in Pennsylvania to pick up a seat.
Chris, let's wrap up our program with a brief discussion about District 17. That would be Christopher DeLuzio. He's the Democrat and the incumbent versus Rob McCurry. And DeLuzio is up now for his first re-election. So what kind of trail has he blazed briefly?
Yeah, and that's interesting because I'll take the first point. It is his first reelection. Incumbents, as we said, have big advantages, but they're most likely to lose in their first attempt for reelection. This is the 17th district. It's a Western Pennsylvania district, basically the western portion of Allegheny County over towards the Ohio border. This was Connor Lamb's old district, largely in terms of its alignment. It's fairly moderate. He won comfortably, but not overwhelmingly last time. He's being pushed again by a House rep. We see House reps taking runs for congressional districts. This is Rob Mercury that's taking him on, who's also a West Point grad. We got some themes today, Larry, military service.
Right.
And it's a type of district, again, that is I think attainable for each parties. The incumbent has an advantage, and this is another district that money. We look at the spending, right? We didn't have a big chance to talk about this so far because we have so much to cover.
Yeah.
But this is another district where the incumbent's advantage in spending, I think, is really important, and we see. In this case, DeLuzio outspending Mercury. So
let's take another minute to understand McCurry's history here. And what do we know about his history in the State House? And like a similar question earlier, how it might translate over to a congressional agenda. Try to tell us in about a minute, Chris.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They have voting records, just like members of Congress. McCurry, when like McKenzie, have that State House record that they could go back to and use as a target, just like you would with any members of Congress. Over time, you target their votes. You have to cast a lot of controversial votes or contested votes, and that gives DeLuzio. It's always easy to say, "Hey, I'm not in politics. I'm outside of politics. I'm running as a fresh voice." Even if it's a different level, like the State House, that's taken away. You get to say, "I've worked in government," but not necessarily give that distance that sometimes challengers like to claim.
All right, Chris Borick, political science professor at Muhlenberg College. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Larry.